Well, self-evidently, I've got to be able to follow that introduction. What I want to talk about, and I think I've been given about an hour, and I think we have tried to create 15 minutes afterwards in order to turn this monologue into a dialogue, which I always find entertaining and informative. But the structure really of what I want to talk about is indeed to talk, and then to show you a clip, and then to talk, show you a clip, etc. So the lights are going to be going on and off. I have this curious notion that cinema works best in the dark. That, you might laugh, is not necessarily true of the future, of course. There's a way in which the Silicon Valley of indeed every country in the world is performing in such a way that the idea of going to watch films in the dark is going to be a characteristic of the past, and that's going to happen very, very soon. But more specifically, considering what's now written rather pompously on the screen, is my quarrel with the word. You know, it says in Genesis that in the beginning was the Word. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Genesis tells us that God sent Adam out to name everything. And how on earth can you name anything unless it already exists, and probably exists certainly as an image? So I think that part of Genesis has to be rewritten. In the beginning was the image. My quarrel is that I suppose in a melancholy moment, think that every single one of you, in fact, has curiously ever seen a film. All you've seen, 1895, let's say a couple of years ago, 2015, a convenient 120 years. I don't think that 120 years really represents a phenomenon which we really can successfully separate as an idea of cinema. I think what you've probably seen is 120 years of illustrated text. Just run your, no doubt, very sophisticated memories across all the movies you've seen, and could you, with your hand on your heart, actually reckon you've ever seen a film which did not start its life as a text? Even, and I used to say, I suppose 20 years ago, a text written on the back of a cigarette packet, but nobody smokes anymore, so I can't use that analogy. But however primitive the original start, genesis, beginnings of a film, you may almost certainly, 99.9%, imagine it was scribbled down, first of all, as a text. And a text does not, it seemed to me, to have the importance we all seem to have given it in the history of cinema. If you think about it, text has so many ways in which to purvey its meaning. Go back, 3,000 years, lyric poetry, Homer onwards. I suppose go back, 320 years for the Western novel. Think of theater, which always hands its ideas and its conceptions down essentially in the word and not an image. So there are more than a few different performances, different ways of purveying information, which text has a very, very hard imprimatur on it. So why can't we actually invent, support, encourage a medium which tries very hard to eschew the notions of text and all it does, and to allow, I suppose, the notion of the prioritization of the image to dominate? My grandmother used to invite me on a Thursday afternoon, she was an old age pensioner in South Wales, to come to the pictures with her. She never ever called it movies or film or cinema, it was always the pictures. And that, I suppose, sort of faux naive position seems always to ring very true to me. Let's really consider that the circumstances of cinema rely absolutely in the power and the prioritization of the image. But, as you all know, we haven't really organized cinema in that way, have we? There is a way, as Goddard famously said, you've got to convince a producer of whatever shape or form or size he or she might be, with the notion of the power of the text first, and then only afterwards will be an appropriation of the image. I still believe that most people, and that includes you, and you have every right to reply back vociferously, I think that most people are visually illiterate. All right, I left a space then, and I heard one or two giggles. But if you think about it, I suppose all over the world, our education systems do indeed force the text down our throats. You know what happens when we're about 9, 10, 11, 12? The teacher says, put away the crayons, fold up the easel, now you've got to get serious. And if that happens, and you do that, and remember, let me phrase it another way. Many extras come up to me when we're preparing a film, and they say, Mr. Greenaway, I cannot dance, I cannot sing, and I cannot draw. Now, that's absolute rubbish. You know very well that children are extraordinarily adept and extremely naturally, without even thinking about it, talented in the business of dancing, in the business of singing, and certainly in the business of drawing. So our teachers, again, all over the world, let me say again, when we're moving, I suppose, from primary school to secondary school, somehow insist that somehow the image is somehow not important enough. Okay, we all live, don't we? Certainly in the Western world, till about 80. You put down the crayons and fold up the easel at 10, that means 70 years of barren, non-image association. And I don't think that I have to underline the fact that although every day we practice the notions of text, as children we learn the alphabet, as adolescents we put the connections together, and as adults we never finish polishing and polishing and polishing our ability to communicate in text, there is by no means, apart from one or two people in comparative notions of society who might be happy enough or fortunate enough to go to art school and to be officially trained, the actual amount of time we spend on the image is minute relative to the amount of time we spend on text. Now, this is not to denigrate, of course, the huge capacity of organization of information and how to use it, which is essentially a notion of the huge textual education we all receive. But I don't think that is particularly a thing to be proud of if we diminish the ability, indeed, to communicate with notions of the image. There have been, it depends maybe upon your historical perspective, I suppose, 45,000 years of image making. And there's only been probably about, maximum 8,000 years of actual text created in the Golden Crescent about 8,000 years ago. And even, I suppose, the very first notions of text were very much to do with pictograms, and we all know where our written text all comes from, the notion, indeed, of the image. If you want to reduce that 45,000 years, I think that's the age of cave painting, now accredited to those extraordinary animals in the south of France. I suppose we want to, for my convenience, I would date probably a sense of painting which is completely understandable now, certainly to the Romans. The Romans very largely, of course, would have painted or created representational images in fresco, which is essentially color in wet plaster, the very, very public art, and often to be seen in the open air, and that means it disappears very quickly, affected by the weather. But I always think a useful date for the beginning, should we say, of Western representational imagery would be, I think the actual date is 72 AD, which is the date of the eruption of Vesuvius, just at the back of Naples. And we know this to be true because in the 17th century, huge excavations in Herculaneum and Pompeii revealed an incredible wealth and richness in deeds of Roman painting. So let's, for convenience of what we're saying tonight, suggest that at least, I suppose, a complete understanding of the notion of representational image would have started then. So let's say that's about 2,000 years ago. Well, in that 2,000 years, of course, there have been a huge amount of imagery made. I'm going to keep my, I suppose, associations very much to do with Greater Europe, which would include the West, which would certainly include America, although we can bring in Asiatic art, which is very interesting for all sorts of reasons, which in some ways contradicts some of the things that I want to say now. But I think that's a sphere of interest that a lot of us, for good reasons, bad reasons, greater education, lesser education, we have some understanding of. So what have we got? Let's say then 2,000 years of extraordinary representational imagery associated with only 120 years of cinema. There's almost no comparison. So maybe a lot of my comments are a bit churlish. Cinema is still very young, maybe so young under some understandings to be almost embryonic, still not delivered from the womb. There's a lot to be said, and I'll be saying it, that the digital revolution, in a curious way, represents a moment of birth. Okay, you might say rebirth, let's use the Italian, Renaissance, in the possibilities of the image really coming into its own. But a very sad thing, it struck me, has happened in 1929 when the silent cinema, but that needs to be discussed because I don't really think there ever was such a thing as silent cinema, developed, I suppose for all sorts of reasons, good and bad, the notion of becoming sound cinema. Chaplin and Eisenstein, two probably of the greatest talents in the Western world and the Eastern Western world, both decried the advent of sound. And there was a particular reason for that. They felt, and of course in some ways I would feel the same way, that sound cinema let you off the hook of looking. You know how it goes. Let me make another analogy. You go to a famous exhibition space in the world, the Louvre or the National Gallery, and you watch the people walking down the paintings. Sometimes a little puzzled, they didn't understand the iconography, what's that painting about, etc. And then they bend forward and they look at the little legend underneath the painting, which of course is in text, lady with a parrot wearing a red hat. That's what it's about. It's about a lady in a hat talking to a parrot. And completely satisfied, thinking they fully understand exactly what the image is all, they move on to the next one, and so on, down the line, down the line, down the line. And you can see the connection that both Chaplin and Eisenstein felt about cinema. There's a way, when the picture gets explained by intertitles, when the dialogue is written up there, when there's some explanation about, in a sense, film or theatrical involvement to help you understand what you think you're looking at, then suddenly the image becomes, I won't say it entirely disappears, but it becomes curiously devalued. And there has been, I suppose, a situation that's happened ever since and continues to happen. So the advent of text to cinema seems to me not necessarily, in a profound way, an actual increase in the strategies and the vocabulary and the grammar and the syntax of cinema. And probably a lot of people argue that the most successful, really successful cinematic cinema you will find is probably from about 1922 to 1929, when a whole series of extraordinary talents, including, of course, Eisenstein, including, of course, Chaplin, really began to understand what cinema was really about and began to develop a imagistic vocabulary that didn't need words, that didn't need text to explain things. However, that then disappeared, and people fell back upon, I suppose, the vagaries of text in order to really promote their meaning. But this has happened ever since. To go back to Godard, who certainly for me, is the major cinematic talent in the middle of the 20th century, he said, okay, this is the way we've invented cinema. First of all, you have to have text before you're allowed to have image, which means that the image is slave to the text. And we've ended up, indeed, with a cinema of illustrated text rather than pure and simple image making. Now, I've got to be careful here because there are all sorts of contradictions. I won't come round and ask each and every one of you why you go to the cinema, but I bet one of those answers is to be told a story. Is it really true? Is that why you come to the cinema, to be told a story? Because that's what most producers think, don't they? You hear it time after time after time after time. Cinema is only as good as its narrative, is only as good as its story, which of course is absolute rubbish. Supposing your favorite film, one of my certain films will be Blade Runner. But then let me ask you, tell me the story of Blade Runner. Okay, you'd set off merrily and you say it was about robots losing control, about all the big brother notions indeed of the machine. But then I reckon that probably within about, 20 seconds you dry up. Because all the detail, all the anecdotal association, all the interplay of action and activity, in some curious way has not exactly disappeared, but has become somewhat of minority interest. And what you remember about the excitements of Blade Runner as some curious cinematic concatenation between event and happening, between performance and color, between a particular mise-en-scène created by the soundtrack, between the music, and I suppose some probing of your memory or imagination, which creates a particular cinematic experience which really isn't about narrativity, is it? It's really not about the notions of text. And we've all of us now, all over the world, whether you're Japanese or whether you're Brazilian or whether indeed you come from Hollywood or from West London, this concern about a particular way of looking at cinema and looking at text. And this, as it were, umbilical cord has connected our notions of cinema to the bookshop. It's part maybe of another big discussion, but okay, let me throw this bomb at you. I think cinema is now dead. Easy thing to say, and I can spend hours explaining why I think that. But there is a way that the notion of what all those extraordinary apologists of the 1910s and 1920s thought about cinema, they really believed cinema would be a most magnificent, mind-changing experience, and we would never be the same again. Okay, it profoundly affected all the other arts, but I don't think it really accomplished what those huge optimists thought about what cinema is. And I really basically believe now that cinema is a medium which could be described as bedtime stories for adults. It is really, is it not, in its most banal form, and let's face it, 90% of all cinema is banal. Do I hear disagreement? What have we done with this amazing, amazing phenomenology which we denigrated by turning it into simply a piece of illustrated text? I think it's very, very sad. I'm always an optimist. I don't think you can ever be anything other than to be optimistic. And I do think that, I would argue famously, I suppose I used to go around the world saying that cinema died on the 31st of September, 1983. Remark that date. It has irony in it, of course, because there is no such date as the 31st of September. But 1983 is supposedly the beginnings of the digital visual revolution, the first beginnings where we could really understand that this new collection of technological languages could really revolutionize this tired and rather boring old notion of the seventh art. I always think that's a desperate misnomer. that cannot deserve to be called the seventh art. To be an art form surely has to pass through a huge amounts of development and contradiction and consideration, and certainly could not be created in a mere 120 years. What are we going to do about this? What are we going to, I suppose, try, I sincerely believe it's worthwhile trying, to re-excite that enormous, I suppose, lightning bolt of excitement that people like René Clair, that people like Salvador Dalí, like people like Buñuel, for example, felt when they really grappled with this extraordinary new medium of visual cinema and tried to turn it into something extraordinary golden. It takes a very, very long time, let me repeat, to develop some sort of really sophisticated art form. I always think the first cinema masterpiece must be Eisenstein's Strike. Anybody seen that film? I'm sure you all know about Eisenstein's next film, which is the Battleship Potemkin. But he made Strike when he was only 26 years old, with hardly any other previous cinematic experience. He had some experience in the theatre, and indeed of projecting film in a theatre, but never, as it were, as a separated proposition standing on its own legs. And if you've seen Strike, it's extraordinary how somebody who's apparently so... Here we go again. I'm going to have to be careful here. All right, I'll stand away. This is probably a good thing, isn't it? Shut up talking and show some film. So, my beef then is that we really should, like, I suppose Rembrandt once said, just because you've got eyes doesn't mean to say you can see. It has to be a developed and educative process. Yet I think it's completely erroneous to imagine that art is not elitist. People with good socialist, Marxist ideas might take great objection to that. But if you think about Lenin, Lenin really realized, and Stalin who followed him, that cinema was the ideal propaganda machine. And that's why they spent so much time and effort and money, and indeed political endeavor, trying to develop a very powerful cinema, of which, again, I'm going to keep repeating this name, Eisenstein, who I think is the greatest filmmaker we've had in the 120 years, certainly began to capitalize and began to realize its strength. All right, contradiction then. If most people go to the cinema to be told a story, and I certainly don't want to create cinematic suicide, I want to go on making movies, you've got to find a way to accommodate what they think they are doing in a cinema, but also to, as it were, try to create other ways in which, and after all, cinema, like theater, is unlike painting, it needs the time to develop, it needs, I suppose, what is it now, a basic 120 minutes to develop its scenario. So I have tried, I think, right from the very, very beginning of my cinema, to see if there are alternative ways in which to structure time in the cinema. Okay, here's the time when actually the computer is now allowed to say something. One of the first things I realized, and I don't know, are you all enthusiasts for the great Italian guru Umberto Eco, who quite recently wrote a book about lists? If you think about the beginnings, indeed, of literacy, which are those tablets made of clay in the round about Baghdad somewhere, which were essentially lists. They were lists of sheep, lists of bales of wool, lists of slaves. So if you think about it, literature began with a series of lists. And I began to think that that might really be at the very, very heart of our whole literary endeavor. Okay, that's a very, very primitive way of explaining, the great masterpieces of world literature in the last 120 years plus. But it's a way of looking at things, and as an experiment, I began to use that as a strategy. So, with my tongue very firmly in my cheek, and with a great sense of irony, I made a film called Windows. Take a look at this, it's very short. I was once asked to appear on Desert Island Discs. I suggested in return we ought to have Desert Island Cinema. What are the 12, is it 12 or 10 films you would like to be marooned on a desert island with? It proved absolutely impossible to do this, as anybody who's tried to maneuver inside the film world with its rights and its distribution deals and so on, that nobody, absolutely nobody, was prepared to allow the BBC to use their films, so the whole thing collapsed. But it was suggested by, I think, the producer of that program, was his name Roy Plumley in those days, actually suggested that that little film would be the number one he would take. Is it a film about narrativity? Well, of course, one way it is. The narrativity is so intense, of course, there's no way that I don't think, unless you watch the film at least 10 times, heaven forbid, that you'll be able to work out this extraordinary crossword puzzle of connections. I do assure you, since I wrote it, that they do work, but I'm not going to challenge you on it. But the actual method of putting statistics together in that sort of way, and I think, again, we have the support of Umberto Eco on that, is it really, really primitively a narrative, or is it doing something else? Is the sheer listing, in fact, a non-narrative preoccupation? Well, in one way or another, that particular strategy has pervaded a huge number of all the films. I must have made over 80 films in the last 40 years. And there's a continuation. I think maybe in some ways it's a prop, a succedaneum, a support structure, so I know in a sense how to organize my material. But I think it is an almost like subversive way to tackle what I would describe as the extreme sort of Henry Jamesian attitude towards our notion of the minutiae of film writing, which seems to be present. I'm looking essentially at darkness, so I'd like to see my audience, but maybe it's time for me to ask a question, because I'm about to make a very large insult. Are there any film writers in the audience? Nobody's putting their hands up. Good for you, because I think all film writers should be shot. We do not need a writer's cinema. We do not need, let me shout this very loudly, a writer's cinema. And this umbilical cord between the cinema and the notions of the bookshop should surely, surely, surely be cut. I have absolutely no problems about word and text and narrativity inside a book, where in a sense it really truly belongs. I have indeed had books, short stories, plays, and scripts published, but that's a separate entity. I think writers have no business in the cinema. Now that's an incredibly dangerous thing to say, isn't it? Just think of the whole list of shouting producers and writers and filmmakers who rely essentially in making cinema as a form, indeed, of illustrated text. How are we going to overcome that? Well, what I always argue for, but it's an absolute pipe dream, is I want to look for a painter's cinema. Cinema is about visual images, about representational notions of the image. And as soon as we can find a way to be able to make or create the notion of a truly painter's cinema, using painters, of course, in the widest possible sense. Marcel Duchamp said a painting is anything you want to call a painting. That's a bit maybe too wide for me, but you can understand his feeling about that. Then I'm sure the richer and more excited we will be about the notions of what all those cinema apologists were on about in the 1920s. Soon after this, with the help of the BFI, British Film Institute, who really, I suppose, set me on my feet, and we're talking now about the very early 1960s. These films are all made in the very early 1960s. I am the cameraman, and I have a 16mm Bolex black and white film-fed camera, which only could be spring-loaded to 17 seconds. So the longest shot I could ever do was only 17 seconds. And believe me, that was a really exacting sort of creation, a strategy. It really set your mind to the significant edge of making every single image very profound. And I called it The Falls. And I think, let me just show you the opening sentence, or the opening structure, the opening, you see, I'm already falling into literary modes, thank you. There is a way in which the titles themselves will dictate what the film is about. It goes on for 92 biographies, and the whole film was 3.5 hours long. But it was a calling card. It did excite all sorts of people all over Europe, and it did get me a little money to make the next film and the next film. So in a sense, that film, The Falls, absurdist, ridiculous, over-enthusiastic excitement about imaginary directories and encyclopedias was really, I suppose, the very beginnings that convinced me that it might be possible that I had some future as a filmmaker. This notion of list making as a structure, as a strategy for organizing film, which of course still associates itself with narrativity. I was not going to, let me say, repeat again, boringly, commit cinematic suicide such that nobody would visit my cinema, run parallel with all sorts of very, I suppose, narrative tropes and paradigms which we're all familiar with, which certainly give you an idea that the animal that I was playing with was certainly some notion of cinema. Very soon after that, I discovered an extraordinary book by a female Japanese author called Sei Shonagon. She was writing about the year 1000. So we say, what's that, 66 years before the Battle of Hastings. Extraordinary that this very, very sophisticated novel, it was called The Pillar Book, and I borrowed the title, but by no means am I illustrating the book, but I'm taking the idea of this idea of list making to even maybe, I hope, more sophisticated areas. I'll quickly show you the prologue so you understand the conception. You can see the strategy. Really, the whole film is a selection of images, one after the other, without any particular association between them in any true narrative sense. I've mentioned the year already, 1983, and I think the Getty Foundation in that year recognized that all over the world there were two collecting strategies which had really become universal. First of all was the decimal system, created by Napoleon very largely, and gradually spread everywhere, so that everywhere in the world has this notion of a count. Let's limit it to 1 to 100. So I'm looking for strategies which are, in a sense, non-narrative, but still capable of organizing material. Witness my enormous excitement about the strategies of making dictionaries and indeed directories. And at the same time, the alphabet was becoming, even in places which did not naturally speak a European language, certainly like, or indeed certainly like in English, the alphabet of A to Z was beginning to structure academic life. So it was certainly recognized in China and certainly alongside their own languages. So I began to use, as it were, these universal languages of the notion of a universal count plus the alphabet as a possible structure to lay alongside the demand of you, the audience, to come to a dark place called the cinema and be told a story. Take a look at this. I often get involved in massive projects which never ever get finished. This was a BBC situation about the domestic home, and rather maybe sensationally, because it offered me opportunities to show nudity. We started in the bathroom. But as you all know, you do many things in a bathroom apart from indeed cleaning your teeth. It goes self-evidently all the way through with some really strange, I suppose, notions indeed of the alphabet in a bathroom. Listening very carefully to the idea that medium is the message, so each particular characteristic develops its own cinematic tile. I have to tell you a little anecdote about these two people. We put I think we put an advertisement in a national newspaper for two volunteers to come and help us make this film. and to perform, indeed, in a jacuzzi. I think the woman came by number 20 bus, and the man came by bicycle. I asked them to take their clothes off, and we left the room so that they could get acclimatized to one another's naked bodies. And they did so indeed, and they performed as I wanted. And then I think 10 months after, I was invited to the christening of their first son. The continuation then of using the alphabet as a self-evident structure. It organizes our libraries, doesn't it? It has done for a long time, but now does so all over the world. Quite recently, I've had a painting exhibition in Murcia in Spain, and there is again an attempt to make an alphabet which is relative to my experiences of living in Amsterdam. You can see the concept. I think the most difficult film that a filmmaker can make is his second feature film. My first film was called A Draftsman's Contract, and then it set up so many expectations that people wondered what indeed I might do next. Well, I'm searching around all the time for finding alternative strategies of which could be associated with narrativity without actually telling you a story. We filmed this in Rotterdam Zoo. One zoo, so many zoos are made piece by piece, but this Rotterdam Zoo splendidly was made by one architect within a space of 5 years, an ideal place. And obviously, what is a zoo? A zoo is an encyclopedia of animals. So I was on a winning street here. The list was already made. But I wanted to go a little further, and I will introduce you to somebody who, of course, you know extremely well. Okay, I'm sure that you could recognize the voice of Mr. Attenborough there. We persuaded him to take part, a small part indeed, because the whole movie was organized, and I was beginning to borrow and steal other people's conceptual organizations of list making, and this represents the 8 stages of the original Darwinian paleontological organization of the beginning of the world, no less. You see, we were getting far too clever by half. Looking at it now, I can't even understand all the complications in that little tiny section you've seen. Like the word Z, if you lose the part of Z, so it becomes 700, so it's a reference indeed to James Bond. You reverse it so it becomes ooze, which becomes the beginnings of life on Earth, and you discover that the two zeros stand for Oswald and Oliver, who are the names of the people. If you manage to get all that stuff together, of course, you've got a really deep sort of three-dimensional dictionary of reference and counter-referation. Okay, another system I borrowed was a film we made in Rome called The Belly of an Architect, where I took the 8 classical periods of architecture of ancient Rome. This is the one that represents, indeed, I'm sure you will recognize this building, at the very beginning of Rome's creation. And a little later in the film, the mid-19th century Italian excitements, indeed, of the Vittoriano, again a building I'm sure you know. It's very curious me showing you this because I'm only extracting one particular part of the structuring of these movies. You can see it's also art history lesson, making comments about the windows, the film frame, making comments about the grid, making comments about symmetry, and sort of ideas of the Sacra Conversazione, where everybody's very choreographically arranged. So that the references and counter-references to make indeed an extremely well-wrought image with lots of significances is part of the situation. And you can also see this obsession with counting, as it were, trying to get away from the particular subjectivity of the notions of text to much more abstract situations. Here's a short clip again. This is meant to be me as a young boy obsessed with death, and you must already see that happening in several of these clips. This is a clip from Drowning by Numbers. The film Drowning by Numbers obviously has certain narrative structures and so on, but witness the title, Drowning by Numbers. The whole film, 120 minutes long, has a number count, starting with number 1 at the beginning of the film, number 100 at the end. People are most grateful for this structure because they know by the time you get to number 50, you know you're halfway looking at the watch. The film won't go on for that much longer. There was a way in which we put those numbers all over the place, some in the soundtrack, some in the music track, and some certainly on the frame. I think we even wrote small numbers on the backs of insects, dragonflies, I think. So you had to be very, very quick to catch this. But again, it was subverting the narrativity with a great sense of irony, of course, to the number count. Here's, I suppose, one of the early reasons, looking back on it, why I was so obsessed by this idea of time and space and counting. I made a documentary on the occasion of John Cage's 70th birthday, and I think probably the film tells you, I won't say any more, I'll just show you the section. The organization of those indeterminacy stories, where every story, if it was a story, or indeed if it was simply an anecdote, or the reportage of an event, had to be said, had to be explained within 60 seconds, within 1 minute. So a story which was very simple, maybe contained only a few sentences, had to be read very, very slowly in order to fill the space. But if you had a story which was 4 or 5 paragraphs long, it had to be garbled in order, again, to make sure you actually presented it within indeed 1 minute. So you can see the arbitrary nature of narrativity and the looseness of our ability to tell stories is very much disciplined by a time system. Okay, I was beginning to explore other possibilities, and the idea alongside a narrative occurred indeed in this film. You probably recognize Helen Mirren already, called The Cook, the Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover. And my basic strategy there was the colors, the 7 colors of the rainbow. Okay, you've seen enough that when people move from one environment to another, and each one is color-coded, it actually affects their particular concern for costume as well. A deliberate attempt to make a demonstration of how valuable color is in terms of our both emotional but also intellectual life. And so it goes on, all 2,000 bombs that have been dropped on this planet Earth, and all recorded, and all this material can be taken off the public records, or used to be, but now everybody is very secretive about dropping bombs, so it's more and more difficult to be able to find evidence of this calumny. But you can see this obsession with finding alternative structures based upon, indeed, almost an obsessive concern about a medium which has so many figures in it, 35 mil, 16 mil, 9.5, and shall we leave the last word to Godard himself, who said that cinema is the truth, 24 frames a second. Thank you.
Peter, on behalf of all of us, thank you for that absolutely captivating talk. Thank you. And I'd like to welcome Maggie Ellis, who's going to ask the audience, throw to the audience for a handful of questions at the end of this extremely inspiring and stimulating session.
Can we get the lights up, please, so we can see everybody? So much to say, so many ideas. And just fascinating. And what I'm interested in is your life as an artist and your practice, and the fact that it cuts across films, writing, VJing, and opera, and so many things. And I think what it brings to light in your films, I mean, they're beautiful, they're exquisite. And I'm a bit of a fan, actually. And I've seen a lot of your work, but there's so much left. I mean, this is just the sort of tip of the iceberg. And there's so much there, and it's such a pleasure for me to see somebody coming into film with a very different agenda and who's so uncompromising and who dares to do and to say and to bring things to an audience that gives it a different agenda. And I just think that is, so thank you for doing that. And I know how long it takes when you've seen something so rich to gather your thoughts and think about what you might want to ask, because there's so much to ask. And I'm not going to go into the text thing, but I might just kick off with one thing. And so I'm very interested in the way you collaborate. And we can't go into, we've only got 15 minutes, so please, we want to open it up to as many of you as possible, so keep your answers quite quick and brief. How you work with sound designers and people who do your musical scores, because as well as the richness of the image and the framing and the beauty of it, they look like paintings, there's also the richness and the texture of the sound. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit about that.
Well, concepts like, I suppose, the Nouvelle Vague, which introduces to the idea of cinematic auteurism. Let's be snobbish about it. I mean, auteur is just simply the French word for author. But it does apply, doesn't it, that generally cinema is, even in terms of directors, I mean, most directors around the world are hired hands. They don't write the material they direct. It's never been necessarily part of their obsession to make the films, which in a sense come from their inner being. And I've been extremely fortunate, I suppose, well-educated Englishman, part of the humanistic situation. So, I have some ability to write in the first place, even though I detest the idea of screenwriters. And then I went to art school, indeed, and was there for 4 years and learned to paint. And then when my first job, I suppose, within the British film industry was as a film editor. So yeah, you've got the three components: writing, making images, and putting them together. Unfortunately, I cannot write music. But as you can see, I've worked with some extraordinary musicians, primarily in the early days, of course, Michael Nyman, but Philip Glass and John Cage and all that great plethora of people who were associated very much with minimalism, I think, through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So really, really good collaborators. And of course, it's absolutely impossible to do this on your own. You're absolutely right. And, I work with a whole troupe of people. Most of them are aged 16, 17, 18, 19. They're always coming up with all these extraordinary things coming out of Silicon Valley. And it's a bit difficult to treat an old dog new tricks. So I rely on these people to feed me with all the potentiality of all this really exciting new literacy.
And can I open it up to the audience, because I'd like you all to get your questions in. I saw you first.
Just a little observation, Peter. Do you think if more camera obscurers were put around the place, this might make us more visually aware, or that you were stressing that we need to be concentrating on visuals, and they are simply a picture, aren't they?
Well, yes, up against that, I'm sure Sheffield is full of surveillance cameras. There's probably 6 in here. Every traffic light, every intersection, inside every chemist shop, there is a camera. So the world, is full of us being observed. So much so that you feel if you're not on camera, you don't exist. So putting that up against your question, and also remembering that Johannes Vermeer, brilliant Dutch painter, was actually using a camera obscura way back in 1605. So they've been around for a long time. Certainly, absolutely, make no apology. I want to push for the idea of seeing and looking and seeing. It might sound very sort of reactionary, but I think, nobody should be allowed to pick up a camera until they've spent 3 years painting. If not actually physically painting, then considering. Because it's all about seeing and looking and seeing. And I have to say this again, even though it's very maybe politically unpopular, art is a very elitist phenomenon. It has to be taught. It has to be part and parcel of our education system. It's far too late now, but I once wished to be the cultural minister in Wilson's government. You remember Wilson? It's an awful long time ago. That when I was really very politically activated. And I feel, that the whole business of visual literacy should be part of the world's curriculum. For Christ's sake, open your eyes.
I saw one over there before this. Yeah, Esther. Yeah. See, it's going to be longer than 15 minutes.
Thanks for that. That was great. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about actually working with sound designers and composers. Is it the image that comes first, as your description of Genesis, or is it the sound that comes first? And then just a short second question. It strikes me that actually the visual presence of text in terms of typography is very important in your work, and I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Well, if I answer your second question first, if it itches, you have to scratch it. If I'm going to go on complaining about text in the cinema, let me show you what it does. Let me show you how it operates. Let's embrace calligraphy. You know, in the West, you know, we've given up on calligraphy, you know, when the monasteries were knocked down by Henry VIII. So we've lost something, you know, that very important relationship of the head, the arm, the hand, the finger, the paper, so that every time you inscribe a letter R, it's different in every single word you put it. Now we're all super sophisticated about all the fonts we can find on our laptop, but that's no equivalent to this incredibly rich language which Western society very largely has disappeared. I worked for a long time on the film The Pillar Book with a brilliant calligrapher from the West. He was actually from Houston, but he behaved like a 14th century monk. And his ability to inscribe, let's take the letter R again. You know, he could make it masculine, feminine. He could make it dead, alive, made of wood, made of metal, just by making the letter. So the language sensitivity was extraordinarily rich. Still find it, I suppose, in Japan and maybe China, but even there, it's rapidly dying. It's a whole new excitement, which unfortunately, you know, it's like the loss of the white rhinoceros. You know, this part of our culture is collapsing. Okay, an awful lot of good things are being put in its place, but that's inevitability. But before it dies, let me make a film about it, and it's called Pillar Book.
I know there's some hands there, but I think I need to go over to this side, but I've seen you. I'll go to the front row there.
Can you tell us something about your new documentary? Because we're at Documentary Festival, it'd be great to...
Yes, I suppose I should have talked about that. I'm at a documentary film festival, aren't I? But, you know, I really believe, and I really think secretly you believe, there's no difference, is there, between a documentary and a feature film. Let me put it another way. I believe there is no such thing as history, there's only historians. You cannot visit history, and therefore we are all based upon other people's opinion of it. And most of our history is learned through text and not through image. There is a wariness about using historical evidence, which is basically an image rather than text. And we all know, from Julius Caesar to Winston Churchill, that all historians are liars. They're all out for personal satisfaction. I don't think there's a single history that's ever created purely for the excitement of writing a history. You have to be commissioned, you have to be paid. To write a good history, it takes 3 or 4 years. Consider Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. That wasn't about the Roman Empire, it was about the British Empire. So every historian has a vested interest. So much so, I would argue that probably history is only a branch of literature. Many people have said that before, and if there are historians in the room, they will be appalled. But I sincerely believe that's the truth. You cannot visit history. I have an idea that's not answering your question at all, is it?
What is your area of inquiry?
There's difference between documentary. There's the most absurd. I live in Holland, and I'm sure you're all aware of this. When you look for funding for a documentary, you have to write a script. Isn't that ridiculous? Isn't that ridiculous? That means you are preordained, you've got everything organized, and you're only going out to film what you've already considered to be notions of the truth. A complete misrepresentation of what documentaries are. I would rather be accused of telling you lies by making a feature film than trying to pretend I could tell you truths by making a documentary. And I believe the difference between the two is paper thin. I know there are probably a lot of documentary filmmakers maybe or associated in the audience. Perhaps you don't want to know that. But, you know, the human subjectivity is essential, and isn't that what excites us? So the notion of making, you know, a documentary about polar bears in Alaska is probably going to tell us more about the filmmaker than it is about the bears.
Somebody from this side. There's two here. Oh, gosh, so many of you. You were first before the man in blue at the top. You. It's just, I'm going to get that one so fast.
Thank you very much for that amazing presentation. I've been following your work since I was a little boy. Just want to
say, can I just, sorry,
Yeah.
these questions are provoking. Right? You know, Voltaire said we all of us had to read all the novels before we were 21, because as a little boy, if I quote you, that is the time to grab the audience. I think, in a curious way, we ought to see all our feature films before 21. After 21, the suspension of disbelief collapses.
I come here, all scientists, they said as well, you come up with all your theories before the age of 20. Anyway, what I wanted to know is, in your pursuit of coming up with these amazing the experimental ways of coming up with new ways of describing narrative, what exactly, and moving away from the causal narrative forms from that somehow Aristotle has put on our laps, what have you found to be the most effective way of putting together strands of ideas in a pure way in order to present it as a coherent and effective narrative form?
Well, there's a whole series of painters. I think Jackson Pollock was one, Rembrandt was certainly another, Van Gogh was another, and Monet another, said that the very best painting is non-narrative. And the best way to present an idea is to establish it in a painting. Now, I know maybe for non-painters that might be quite a problem to wrap your imagination around, and some might think it's too simplistic. But when you think of the extraordinary images that do exist in the world and are part of our common inheritance, I would like to answer your question in that particular way. You know, Rembrandt's The Night Watch has as much to offer us as Dante's Divine Comedy. Monet's Water Lilies has as much to advise us, I don't know, as the most recent novel by Calvino. There is a way, isn't it strange, especially in England, who demotes the idea of the image. You remember was he the first director of the Royal Academy was Joshua Reynolds. And he was bold enough to write a series of journals about Italian painting. And the English establishment said, no painter could write like that. He must have had a ghostwriter. Do you know that really disgusting affair with a brilliant American-English painter, R.B. Kitaj, who had a big exhibition at the Tate Gallery, and the entire British press excoriated and demonized it because the guy was so damned articulate and could explain himself in words as he could in painting? Why is it the English are so anti-image? Are you surprised I live in Holland?
The lady here with the white T-shirt.
Hi, thank you again. You are such a polymath, and I think in today's, as you mentioned, in today's cinematic sort of landscape, everyone is encouraged to become more and more streamlined into a certain task or a certain profession, certain title. Can you just comment on that and perhaps encourage us to not do that or give us instructions on how to survive?
Well, it's our education system, isn't it? It's determined to be tidy and put you all in boxes. It's exactly the same, you know, with journalistic, artistic criticism. And isn't it, relative to your question, all the isms of art are insults. You know, fauvism, like wild beasts, rococo, baroque, all these are insults created towards painters by basically literary critics. So I think that, in a curious way, is indicative of a part answer to your question. And I certainly do believe we're all encouraged to be specialists, and I'm convinced we should be generalists. Only connect. I've forgotten who said that, with D.H. Lawrence. Only connect and make sure that you have a grasp, indeed, of all those amazing connections that bind us all together. I suppose, basically, all the world has the same education system now, doesn't it? And all of that education system is extremely weak I believe, in the proselytizing of the power of the image, and we ought to do something about it. And you're, me no longer, I'm 75, I'm going to be dead in 10 years, but you're probably only about 25 maximum, so it's your future. Get on with it, and do something about it.
I've just been told we've got time for 2 questions, and I saw you first because you've had your hand up a lot, and the lady up there, at the, I think, was it you? Yes. Yeah.
Hi, Peter. Glad to meet you again. I'm here.
Hi.
We met once in Rome 5 years ago. About creative process. So once you have an idea and it's on your mind, obsessing all your energy, and then you create something. Does that obsession leave you, or does it still haunt you?
I think the second of those things, and you've been very percipient in that. You know, when we make a film, I never want to leave it. I want to remake it again or continue. And so there's a way that often the films come in twos. I made a film about 5 years ago about Rembrandt, but then had so much more to say about Rembrandt that actually I was allowed to make a documentary, so-called, considering what the definition of documentary is. So there's a way, I suppose it's a common phenomenon, isn't it, that an artist's total life is really one work. The works don't necessarily come in a good order, and you know, maybe some of them are very sort of inferior or unhappy. You saw a short clip from a film I made called Z and Two Noughts, which is not very well acted and is somewhat clumsy. But if anybody would ask me to make a film again, that would be the film I would make again. I think Chris Pettit of Time Out, way back in 1968, said that there were 3 films desperately trying to get out there. It was a film about the world as an arc. It was a film about what would we do if we met our twin. And it was also a film, much more materialistically, about 26 different ways to light the world. You could see a heavy agenda to be contained in 100 minutes.
I'm afraid we can only have the last one there, and we could stay here all night, I'm sure, because there's so many questions, so I'm sorry we have to
And I was
fold
hoping
it.
to show you a clip, a trailer, after this question of the film we're working in now. Can I do that? Ask your question.
Hi, a little bit off topic, but hopefully on topic about the dominance of image today, actually, because what I see a lot of is GIFs and memes, and actually it seems that the image dominates because people have no patience at all to read anything or to hear a story. What they want is that, you know,
But
snapshot.
couldn't you say the same thing? People have very little patience to actually examine an image. You know, all these great writers like Paul Klee and Panofsky who've been talking about the power of the image, but people don't even understand the difference, you know, between, shall we say, atmospheric and geometric perspective. They don't even understand those things that Polanski learned. You know this famous thing, when characters enter from the left, they're always positive. When characters enter from the right, they're always negative. All these sort of basic tenets, which are part and parcel of a visual education, most people seem to be entirely unaware of. They don't even understand that this huge amount of information exists. Why? Because people, in a sense, you know, demutize the image. They don't consider it serious enough to be a subject for really serious instruction. I'm beginning to be very repetitive now.
I think it would be very nice to finish on a clip.
Okay, we're making a film about a sculptor, Brancusi, who in 1906 walked, because he was so damn poor he couldn't even afford the train fare, all the way from Bucharest to Paris. The film is called Walking to Paris because if you wanted to be anything in the artistic world at the beginning of the 20th century, you had to be in Paris. Take a look. This is just a sort of trailer introduction. We've shot most of the film, but on Thursday of this week, I'm off to Sicily to start shooting the next episode.